Hi, welcome to the Designer Series, where you have a seat at the table. We're here at Naval X in Alexandria in the Building Momentum workshop, where we can roll up our sleeves with some tough questions on some of the topics that are coming from our track challenges. In today's first session, we're taking on the topic of balancing cybersecurity and autonomy in the maritime domain. Increasing autonomy in the maritime domain is coming at a time of increasing concerns for maritime cybersecurity in general. So we're going to look at how we address some of the different challenges with people who are far smarter on this topic than me. I'm Nicole Mullins, and we met earlier as your co-host, and we're going to meet some of our guests here today. So I believe we have some people who are with us on Zoom as well, but I'm going to start right here to my right and have you introduce yourself and tell us why this topic is interesting to you.
Thanks, Nicole. My name is Will Loomis. I am an assistant director at the Atlantic Council's Cyberstatecraft initiative, and at the Atlantic Council, I help lead our work on maritime cybersecurity. First of all, a big thank you to Nicole, to the team at HACKtheMACHINE, and as well from Fathom 5 and for Booz Allen for having us today, and the Navy. I'm very excited for being here today. So first of all, just a little bit about the Atlantic Council and the Cyberstatecraft initiative. We are a nonprofit think tank based in DC, working with kind of allies and partners to try and address and solve some of the most pressing geopolitical issues out there. Particularly my team at the Cyberstatecraft initiative, led by Dr. Trey Herr, really focuses on how we can deal with problems that emerge around the intersection between cyber and technology, and larger problems in geopolitics and statecraft. And for us, one of the key issues that we've talked about and worked extensively on in the last year is maritime cybersecurity. So just to talk a little bit about how we kind of got to the focus that we're at today, we really wanted to build off of December 2020, the National Maritime Cyber Plan that really highlighted maritime cybersecurity as a key problem set and one that needed to be addressed. We really thought that this was a great first step, but we wanted to get a little bit deeper and a little bit more operational on the problem set. So we actually spent about a year of work and research, as well as engagement with key stakeholders within the community, both private sector, public sector, and international, to kind of map out where some of these risks lie in the maritime domain and the MTS, the maritime transportation sector, and to identify some potential points of leverage that we can build upon to raise the baseline for cybersecurity in the MTS.
Okay, I'm going to pause you right there, because I do believe that we have a cohort of yours on the line here, and a friend of us for over at Fathom 5. I have Dr. Gary Kessler with us on Zoom. Gary, can you tell us a little bit about your work with the Atlantic Council and what you're doing and who you are?
Well, I actually, for good or for bad, wear a ton of hats. One of them, as Will does allude to, I was one of the co-authors on the report with Atlantic Council. I hold the lofty title of a non-resident senior fellow there. I'm also a principal consultant with Fathom 5. I hold a national office with the Coast Guard Auxiliary related to cyber augmentation. I'm a visiting faculty member at the Coast Guard Academy. So that's well, among the many hats that I wear. I keep telling my wife I'm retired, and she keeps telling me that I don't really know what that word means. But one of the reasons this all resonates with me is I've been involved in the information security field for some decades. So many decades, it obviously predates cybersecurity as a term. But as it relates to this specific topic, with autonomy, with automation and autonomy as well, is first of all, the automation and the autonomy so increases the attack surface. And I just heard way less about how to secure autonomous systems than I think I should be hearing about. But as a mariner, because I also have a captain's license, small boat, but captain's license nevertheless, I also wonder about things like what's the impact of an autonomous vessel going to be on the collision regulations? And, do we adapt the collision regulations to autonomy, which I don't think is going to happen. So autonomy is going to need to adapt itself to the collision regulations, and interesting to see how we're going to do that in a safe way.
I think that we're going to have a very dynamic conversation, but before we go too much further, I have Commander Michael Pine, who's also joining us, and he's still in uniform. So I would imagine he's pretty concerned about this topic as well. But I'll let him talk about his interest in this and introduce himself. Sir?
Hey, thanks, Nicole, and it's nice to meet everyone. I'm nowhere near as distinguished as my two co-panelists here, but I do know a bit about cybersecurity, and I've also had some time on the pond, so to speak. In my previous role in the Navy, I was a submarine officer and qualified officer of the deck, so got to actually, use some autonomous systems there. It's relatively novel to hear about autonomous systems now, but, some of the dirty secret is it's not new to the Navy. We've had experience here, and experience that I think can help inform, the way we approach cybersecurity and the benefits we want to get from autonomy.
Okay.
So definitely excited to see where this conversation goes.
So am I. So there's 2 points of logistics I want to make sure I address. So there's a QR code that way. Yeah, there we go. Right there on your screen. And we encourage you to use that, or on the site you'll see a link that goes to Slido. We're tracking that, and all of your questions and comments and concerns will be brought up, and I'll get to see them. I have lovely Parker over here helping me so I can see the questions and get them engaged in the conversation. We're gonna start with some basics though, guys, because I will tell you that while I've been working with the Navy for a while, there's a lot about the maritime domain I don't know. So for the audience members who may have the same sort of background as me, where they're not coming from the fleet, can you talk about some of the key issues, before we get into the autonomy piece, some of the key issues right off the bat in the maritime domain that we need to be thinking about in general, and then they're going to touch into cybersecurity. I don't think we can get around that. And whoever would like to go first, I'll open the floor.
I'm happy to start. I would just say, super briefly, I think that there are 3 kind of key issues that I wanted to bring up in terms of, problems that exacerbate the insecurity in the MTS. I will be brief, as I know my other panelists will have other stuff to mention here, and happy to go in depth on them a little bit later. But first, I think the maritime domain goes back, hundreds of years and decades, and a lot of the time we have systems that are still in use on ships in the MTS that have been around for decades as well. And as we kind of innovate and as technology continues to become a more important part of what we do on the water, a lot of operators and owners have been stacking new technology and adding new innovation to pre-existing ships. This is great. Technology is important. It allows us to act more efficiently. It increases bottom line, and it's really important for pushing forward the MTS in terms of the way we operate. However, it must be done with cybersecurity as a core component of that process. So as we stack on new technology, and one thing we're talking about here specifically is kind of automation, and as Kess mentioned, increase in digitization, it's important that we also focus on bringing cybersecurity in at the design level to make sure that these systems that we're adding on to our pre-existing platforms or bringing into the ecosystem as a new type of platform is actually secure at that first step.
So let me pause. You said increase I can't say the word. Digitization?
Oh, digitization. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
increase digitization. Okay, so that we're really talking about is when we say new technology, software.
Yeah, connectivity.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily I'm bringing in a new weapon or a new whatever. It's all of the additional software and algorithms that we're adding into the system. Got it. Tracking. Okay, so having cyber baked into that from the start. All right, that makes sense. What would be your second point?
Yeah, and that's especially important when we talk about kind of what we refer to as more operational technology, where it's technology like software controlling physical systems. And that looks differently, totally different across the MTS. It could be ballast systems on a ship. It could be gantries in a port. It's going to look completely different. But particularly with those systems, it's critical that they're secure. The other 2, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of the panelists here. The first one is essential that we continue to push forward our maritime workforce. Training and making sure that people in the ecosystem actually understand these problems and how we can address them is one of the most important ways to make sure that the broader MTS is more secure. And we're really lagging behind here. This is a problem that is distinctly focused in the MTS because we need to not only teach mariners how cyber works, but teach cyber workforce professionals how it works in the maritime domain. So that type of education and training is a really critical part of any solution.
So if I'm hearing this correct, and anyone can correct me, we're not just talking about the Navy here.
Absolutely not. The MTS is probably one of the most interconnected ecosystems out there. You have private sector actors who really own and operate a lot of the core infrastructure that helps the MTS succeed. We also have a plethora of international players here who interact with the Navy as well as the private sector in the United States on a daily basis across the world. So you can't just secure just the Navy or just the private sector in a silo. You need to make sure that you're thinking about the entirety of the MTS and how we can make it systemically more secure.
Okay, and your third point?
Yeah, the last one is, and this kind of is a big point that we make in the report, which was launched in early October, but the MTS is a very differentiated system of systems. So ports are going to have a different set of problems than ships will, which will have a different set of problems. Or just within ships, looking at everything from a container ship will look different from a Navy warship, which will look different from a tug, and those systems and what those attack surfaces look like are going to be very differentiated. So when we talk about security, and this could be anything from regulations to kind of NIST protocols and frameworks for security, we need to be more granular and more specific about how we look at these individual system sets. In the report, we talk about making security framework profiles that outline best practices for specific subsets of the MTS. That is just one way to approach this, but it's key that you think about the MTS as a collection of different systems that are all interconnected when it comes to security and cybersecurity.
All right. No, that was a really good answer for my first one. But
enough of me talking. I'm excited to hear from you.
Yeah, I was going to say, Gary, Commander Pine, anything to add to that? Those were 3 good starts. What other key issues should we be thinking about?
Well, from my perspective, there certainly, there's probably a ton of key issues. But one thing I'd like to link off of what Will said, and Will knows I'm going to say this anyway, we do throw around the words digitization and digitalization a lot, which sound a whole lot alike because they only differ in 2 letters. But as the world is becoming more digital and more digitalized, I'd actually like to spend just a minute talking about that. I mean, we've spent the last 50 plus years digitizing more and more things. And by digitizing in this context, I mean, we're converting what had formerly been an analog process or analog systems, and we're now making them digital and more computer-based and, that kind of stuff, which is not the same as digitalization, which is actually an extraordinarily huge transformation and revolution in the way we consider things. And so I'd like to I'm going to give an example. Back when I was a young person, and I'm surely the oldest person on this call, back when I was a young person, telephone calls were all analog. Our voice is analog, our telephone system was analog. And then during the 1960s, we started to convert to digital. So instead of carrying analog signals, we carried them as 0s and 1s. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons we did that. There was a whole bunch of advantage on why digital telephony is better than analog telephony, and I'm not going to go there. Where I do want to go is, because everything was digital and we needed to repeat the signal periodically, it also meant there was storage of the signal. And all of a sudden, we now have processes that instead of being analog, by being digital, we have the capability to start storing historical information. And all of a sudden, we're building up big databases. Big databases is the genesis of machine learning and what we're now today calling artificial intelligence. Back when I was in grad school in the 70s, artificial intelligence, we were thinking about, a robot with a brain. That's not what we think about anymore. We think about algorithms that can look at big data sets, and if the algorithm is correct, hopefully we get good outcomes. That's not digitalization. Digitalization was an entire transformation. And again, using my story from communications, where somebody said, wait a minute, voice is digital. I can digitize audio. I can digitize video. And now all of a sudden, I can take all of those different data streams, put them onto a single network with a single network backbone, and now I can have a single device that can now do voice and audio and video together. That was a transformation. Because when I digitized voice, so what? It didn't change the process of making a telephone call. I still had to use my rotary dial phone to make the telephone call. Now everything is different. That's why we're able to have this Zoom call. So that is where sort of the basis for my comment earlier, that the attack surface is now enormous. Because I can attack a vessel in some cases by attacking the algorithms, by attacking the data set. I don't even need to attack the ship. I have an entire system that I can attack. So, one of the things that also comes out of this, and it'll be my final point, I'm happy to turn this over to Mike, is that it is impossible to know who's going to attack you, when they're going to attack you, why, and how. So we cannot possibly have an attack-proof system. We have to have one, therefore, that's appropriately resilient. And be able to respond to the attacks in some sort of dynamic fashion and have some sort of appropriate failover, which goes back to the discussion that we've all had. I've read really not a whole lot about anybody plans on securing an autonomous vessel. I've seen a lot about the security problems. I've seen a lot about the plans, but not a lot of press on the other.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I have either. I think, so, one of the reasons I wanted to start with the basics, and Mike, you and I have definitely talked about like bringing the community in, right? Is we read stuff in the news and we're probably going to read it different than you guys do, right? And we're going to see different things in there. And so it's interesting that you say, you haven't seen a lot about it. I definitely haven't because I haven't been looking for it. I wouldn't know what to look for. So I wanted to start with kind of these basics of like, what are the key issues? And then you guys are actively getting right into the problem set of the cyber and the autonomy piece, right? Cybersecurity in general is a buzzword, right? It's a word everyone talks about and everyone says they are doing or working on or doing something towards. And on the naval side, we talk about continuous ATO and all of these other things to get controls in place so that we can have cybersecurity baked in. I've never thought of beyond that in the terms of the other maritime environments, and I've certainly never really had the opportunity to think about like, okay, what about an autonomous system? So let's say you had autonomous shipping vessels out there, right? What happens if I didn't think of them having cybersecurity concerns, quite frankly. So so those are good topics and good things to think about, and I definitely can see the perspective of sort of like supply chain, global world order, things moving in the oceans, that perspective. I do also wonder about the perspective on the manned systems, right? So if I've got people actually on manned vessels interacting with these, kind of what that means for them in a cybersecurity, like is there a risk to them with autonomous systems in a cybersecurity perspective as well? But Commander Prime, we haven't given you an opportunity to respond at all, so let me stop talking and give you the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And I think Gary and Eric both make really good points. Attack surface is something near and dear to my heart. And just like Eric said, it's also not just the ships that are out there. It's not just the Navy warships. There's like entire system of systems such that, even if your operational technology and your IT on a warship is secure, maybe it's not good enough because if the port that you're going to as a warship, is going to get cyber attacked, and now you can't dock there. Now it's unsafe to go there. And likewise, we've seen a lot of supply chain issues in the past year that, although we're not related to cyber attacks, like whenever given happened, the thing that instantly hit the media, ooh, was someone cyber attacking? Like, it's that kind of question's out there, and it's for good reason because, these things, if they happen due to cyber attack one time, what's to say it can't happen 10 times or 100 times and really jam up our global supply chain. I think the other thing that comes back to for me is the question of trust. Is sometimes if a ship doesn't do the right thing, people will kind of intuitively ask, is it a cyber attack? But we've seen even software trying to make things autonomous on its own is going to lead to questions like, can I trust this to autonomously do the right thing, even independent of a cyber attack? If this ship is going down the dog legs of Kings Bay, Georgia, and it's got to make 3 turns in rapid succession. Yeah, it could do it, but is it going to do it? And how do you verify and how do you validate that you can trust this AI, this machine learning, this autonomous system to be able to do it in a way that's safe, and is also safe in regards to other shipping traffic that's out there, in regards to other traffic that maybe doesn't follow the collision regulations as closely as a Coast Guard flag vessel might, and that kind of thing. But I think they're similar, right? I think the thing that you do to build out the trust in your autonomous system, being able to prove and validate, can also help you as you start to attack the cybersecurity question as well. But I think going back to Eric's point, you got to start thinking about that ahead of time. You can't just pile up systems that are historically there, link them together, and not have a thought for the cybersecurity of what can result, because complexity is the enemy of security. I'll stop there.
So,
Mike, I think you made an excellent point that hopefully won't get lost. I don't think right now we could look at an error that a vessel might make, particularly an autonomous vessel in this context, and I don't think we could differentiate an AI error from a cyber attack.
okay.
Yeah, and you think about how would you detect a cyber attack nowadays? It's things like logging. How do you retain the data that proves that there was a vulnerability that was exploited? With a cloud-based system, you still have to design it, but it's easy to do, easier to do.
Right.
With your ancient technology on a ship that got kludged together, how do you know that there's even going to be data to look at to say, oh, that was definitely a cyber attack?
Sure. In my field, they sometimes refer to this as forensic readiness. We're not.
So I think that's interesting because, ships have been around for a really long time, guys. Longer than any of us.
Shocker.
Shocker, right? And so you'd say, well, there have always been some things we've worried about with ships. That's why we changed what the hulls are made of, we changed the systems that are on them, et cetera, et cetera. We've changed over time, but they don't change fast. It takes a long time to build a ship. It takes a long time to get the physical pieces in place. Software is much faster to change, much easier to change. And so you're thinking, well, we're moving fast and we're helping them modernize as best as they can. And I would come back to the question of, been around for hundreds of years, why is this suddenly so important right now? Why can't we'll get to it when we get to it type of thing? Why is this an issue right now that we need to be talking about?
Well, I actually need to challenge something you just said, Nicole.
Okay.
Your observation was the software is easy to change? Absolutely not.
Okay.
Particularly in operational technology where you have embedded systems. It is very, very difficult to change. And in some cases, there's regulatory issues not allowing you to make changes, at least not willy-nilly. So that becomes one of the problems we certainly have in OT. It's a very, very serious problem. And then we already have the problem that, software is easy to change. Microsoft is doing it on a weekly basis. Do we keep up with patch management?
Yes. And those of us on the Navy side who are in flank speed feel that in a real way. I will take that correction because software feels easier than building a new ship, but it's not actually, right? There are levels and layers to that, and so that's a fair correction there. I still don't know. I still wonder about timing, right? Because we are always got to prioritize. What are we working on now? But this does feel like, Admiral Selby just talked about it. Chris Cleary talked about it. There has been a really big cyber focus for at least the last 10 years, right? It might have been around for before then, but it's now out in the open, constant conversation. In the maritime community, why?
So I think safety and security has always been something that is really core to the way that both the maritime industry as well as the Navy thinks about their systems. This is something going back hundreds of years. It's a really important thing. But I think that the way we need to think about those problems has changed due to some of the digitization and the added technology that Kes was talking about earlier. Very rarely now can you say that your ship is completely secure just because you've secured the physical ship itself. So adding in all this new software and stuff allows malicious actors to actually change and influence what is going on board your system remotely.
Let me hold you right there.
Yeah, go ahead.
So does that mean that, I'm really glad that you gave the definition of digitization versus digitalization. They're two long words. There's too many things going on there. But I like the definition changes there, right? And that helped me, it has a lot of clarity. Should maritime community be looking at less of digitization, less of just going from analog to digital, and more of a digitalization and a complete paradigm shift on how we're creating certain systems? And I know it's harder, but is that something that would have the security baked in better than what we're currently doing?
I defer to the rest of the group and would love to hear what they have to say about that question.
Yeah, I think no pun intended, and no use of poor metaphors, that ship has sailed. I think maritime is already at the digitalization phase. This is the so-called Industry 4.0. Maritime's already there. if we're going to build autonomous vessels, and Mike already alluded to this, I think, Mike, didn't the Navy's autonomous ship program start like in 2012 or something?
Oh, we've had lots of experience with autonomous ship programs dating back to at least to 2012. But even before that, like, kind of the thing I was hinting at was, we had a thing on the boat, the Ohio class called Fred,
Okay.
which was supposed to stand for something smart, but what we ended up calling it was the frickin' ridiculous electronic device because, it was just notionally an autopilot, right? It was never complicated, but
Yeah.
a 3D autopilot under the water, but it didn't work right, and that got you back to that question of trust.
So you're telling me that people in the Navy actually say frickin'? Huh. Interesting. Anyway, but the point being is again, digitization is the same process. It's only zeros and ones. The digitalization transformation has been going on already for a long time. And again, I think it culminates in fully autonomous vessels, which we've already seen any number of trials in the last 2 years. I think the Navy just actually did one, sending a couple of vessels from Mobile, Alabama to Fort Waimea. I think the only time it wasn't fully autonomous was when it was going through the Panama Canal Zone. But in Japan, they've been doing a bunch of trials in, I know, Scandinavian countries. So, like I said, we're well into the industry 4.0.
There's no value statement, though, that
MTS
one
phase.
is better. There's no value statement there that one is better than the other, though. So they're
No,
both going to be in the
not at
fleet.
all.
They're going to be out in the water, and they have
Yeah.
to work together. Okay.
Right. Well, one is built on the other. You can't digitalize until you've digitized, if you will.
Got it. Okay.
I think I think also the thing is, the value is there to do things differently if you can get into that kind of full digitalization, autonomous thing. I think that's why it's interesting for industry is that it lowers costs. But even in a kind of defense use case, imagine the things you can do if you can start putting ships into harm's way again without having 400 American lives on board. And that could be good and that could be bad, right? Because there's also sometimes nice to have bright dividing lines that say, if you step over the line, you and I both understand that you're trying to do something. Whereas if you send an unmanned system over the line, now we're kind of maybe in a grayer zone. We've seen that kind of work for us. We've seen that work against us, frankly. But it gives you options. And also in the military use case, the budget can't go and increase, infinitely and forever, right? We got to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So if we can make the same missions happen at a cheaper, bottom line, that's also good for us and good for our ability to defend ourselves and our partners.
And because of the mixed community, if you're solving for one, you're probably solving for many. Once you start to figure out some of these on the cybersecurity side, some of the solutions.
Yeah, and I think this is an example that Kess always talks about, where you can't just secure one part of the MTS. So just using the example of the United States, in a lot of our ports, we actually house the Navy units and naval systems at the most inside of that port. So even if those systems are the most hardened compared to other in the MTS ecosystem, just for example, a malicious actor targets a commercial ship in between the entries to that port and where the naval systems are and causes it to become immobile for a couple hours, shuts down operations in and out. That directly affects naval systems without actually attacking or breaching their systems with a cybersecurity vulnerability. So it's just key that you really need to secure the entire MTS. You can't just focus on the Navy systems because adversaries are smart and will find ways to negatively impact naval operations through commercial systems.
And then like in recent news when it was an accident and it blocked up a certain canal for a long, long time, and every meme in the world has out there about it, and it could have been purposeful.
Yeah, and the economic impact of even that small type of disruption can be massive. I think the numbers around the Suez Canal Ever Given incident was like $9.6 billion a day, which for me was an insane number, even for someone who spends so much time thinking about this issue.
Yeah.
And we've seen it right now, even without any kind of mess up or cyber malicious activity outside of the port of Long Beach leading into the Christmas season. We have massive supply chain backups, and that is partially because of problems with the MTS. So even without these types of malicious activity happening, we've already seen how compounding and how substantial the effects of these types of disruptions are. Now imagine it's a cyber attack.
Right. And then imagine it doesn't have a human in the loop. Imagine it's an autonomous system. That's a whole layer on top of that. Whereas I can't call a sailor or I can't call a captain and say, hey, can you do something about this, because it has a mind of its own, literally.
And because of that digitization, those autonomous systems are more vulnerable to those types of attacks because they're controlled remotely and there's no human on board to help mitigate a potential problem. So as that attack surfaces continue to expand, those systems are going to be more vulnerable, which makes them more potentially worth targeting for those types of disruption operations.
All right.
Oh, that brings up a point I'd like to, just make a quick comment about, is that, all of the autonomous vessels, and right now, some of the designs are for a vessel for which there is no room for a human being. So it's not merely taking today's ship and taking the people off. It's designing ships for which there won't be people. So obviously what we're going to do is end up having, the bridge is going to look, well, a lot like my office. I'm sitting in here drinking my water and it's warm and I'm going to be able to manage the vessel because of whatever. But I think it's naive to believe that we're going to be able to come up with a communication system that will allow me to communicate with and control a ship that nobody can break into.
Okay. That's
and
terrifying.
Well, to build on that, I mean, you would go, okay, well, how would you do that, right? Like, let's assume you can do it. How would you do it? And, look for examples from cybersecurity, outside of ships. And you're already into formal verification, right? Formal methods, heavy math. And we go, okay, let's look at some other things that have been, formally verified. And you see there are things like Wi-Fi standards. I want to say it was WPA2 or WPA3, which underwent formal verification of its security, and they formally verified that it was secure. But what they didn't do is they forgot to leave in resetting the key in the formal boundary of what they secured.
Right.
And it turns out this ends up being susceptible to an attack that will force the router to reset its own key, and now everyone knows the key, and now you've logged into it, and that was with the best that the money can buy, right? Which is not to say don't use these techniques or to don't try, but I would say if I were a betting man, I would assume that the thing can be broken into, and really what you're trying to do is invest enough into it to make it hard to do that, right? So it's at least not trivially breakable.
Yes, that's very true.
I was going to say, it almost sounds like, virtual piracy, right? When you think of maritime, you think about pirates, and they don't have to now come out in a little boat next to you anymore. They can sit at home wherever and pirate your vessel, which is terrifying.
Oh yeah, definitely terrifying.
To think about.
People are going, I'm the captain now.
Exactly, there we are. Well, one mustn't also forget that there are advances in computing going on in parallel to all of this. The impact of quantum computing on anything crypto is going to be pretty significant.
Awesome. Not awesome, but awesome. Awesome to talk about.
Yeah,
awesome.
so I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I'm not a cyber person. I work for a company that is very cyber focused, but I am not. So I'm the outsider in the group, and it's good because it helps me have a little bit of a different perspective. The one thing I will say that I know enough about data analytics and I know enough about how algorithms and all of that work that I can say I feel like we can be the arbiters of our own future in a really smart way, in that baked in from the beginning perspective. What I'm concerned about is, and it goes back to your second point about the workforce, right? I can have a very smart community of people who can build really great tools. If I don't have a really smart community of people who can use those tools and can understand what it is that they have at their fingertips or what the software that they're surrounded by is, humans are dangerous when it comes to computers. So I would say that when you talk about balancing this, that maritime workforce training piece is almost as important as what you're building on the technological side.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think there's several components of that. I know, so you were talking a little bit about around the AI and automation. Obviously, it's important that those systems are created in a secure way, and that's a workforce problem in itself. But particularly when you zoom out a little bit more, it's really a holistic problem across the entire maritime domain. So it's the people on the ships that are running, like the mariners themselves, whether it's on Navy ships or on commercial ships, they need to understand kind of what cybersecurity best practices look like. And right now there's a huge gap in that kind of knowledge. But it really spans across. So the Coast Guard, just as an example, have done like some really good things in the last couple of months. They're doing direct commissions for cybersecurity professionals. They're expanding kind of training and awareness and certification programs. These are examples of things that I think are important to start bringing across the maritime domain like more holistically. In the report, we talk a lot about making sure that there's also cross-collaboration. So the private sector is going to have a different perspective on the issues from the Coast Guard, from the Navy, from international actors. So making sure that there is not only kind of like information exchange between those groups, but also training on the threats that each group sees uniquely and how they're combating those threats.
Well, yeah, to that point, I was going to say, when I think about mariners, right, I don't think of guys with computers in their hands,
Absolutely.
right? And the guys started driving the ship to the point that I think Mike and Gary brought up earlier, Dr. Kessler brought up earlier, being able to recognize an AI error versus a cyber attack, right? I'm driving a ship and something's happening. How do I know what's causing the something that's happening, right? Is it because my software is having a problem, or is it because someone's attacking me? And where do they go to get trained for that? I'm trained to drive a ship. I'm not trained to know that.
Yeah, it's really hard, is the short answer. I think we have talked a lot about and engaged with some of the merchant marine academies, the Naval Academy, the Coast Guard Academy, to try and push this, at least the baseline education into those institutions. But especially as you zooming out for a second, it's really important to, like, probably 90% of the vulnerabilities and attacks targeting the actors in the MTS can be avoided by really following what is kind of referred to as just cybersecurity best practices. So just making sure that people have two-factor identification implemented on key systems, making sure that they are good about password security and don't have, on their system aboard their Navy ship, like big password and admin authentications, and then the password on a sticky note right above. So a lot of the sophistication level of that training isn't needed for the everyday mariner. What we really need to educate is kind of what is that baseline of awareness around cybersecurity that can help mitigate the problem set? Because, as I said, I think probably around 90% of these attacks can be prevented or made less impactful by just everyone following a very low baseline of education. And honestly, this is true for the maritime domain, but it's true across most critical infrastructure and honestly just most offices in the world. A lot of these attacks and a lot of those vulnerabilities can be mitigated, at least to a certain extent, by just people doing the right stuff.
Well, I just popped over to see if there were comments on the thing, and one of the comments was, well, so what if someone bolts on their own technology on the platform? Right? Like they're a member of the crew or whatever. There's a physical
personal devices,
yeah.
Bringing in outside internet connections and connecting things to the internet that shouldn't be connected to the internet. Yep. The way that every ship operates and the way that mariners respond to these types of changes is going to look different on every single ship, and that's going to create differentiated environments on those ships and differentiated attack surfaces. So you can't, it's going to look different for every single person and every single operator.
That actually brings up a good point too, which is you also got to train people to be cyber secure within their role of what they're doing. And so, a question I was going to raise before the commenter raised it was, do you even, for unmanned autonomous systems for autonomous systems that have people on board, does it necessarily make sense to make it possible for those people to update the system, to update the embedded system, to update the OT? I would argue it may not. And that may be something you reserve to when the ship is in port, or an over-the-air update from the cyber-trained professionals who understand those embedded systems because they built them, right? So now it's not just making the system tamper-proof from hackers, but making the system tamper-proof from the crew. Is that something you got to talk about? And I know as a captain, you would never accept that. Like, oh no, right. that thing on my ship, I got to have, I got to be able to break into it. So that goes again back to that question of trust. Because if you are going to let the captain have the ultimate say on the software that's running on the embedded device, how do you segment that so you can do that safely, right? So that if the crew decides to add in their video LAN player or whatever, so they can watch a movie on the mid-watch, how are you going to keep that from breaking your system? I would say, I would also say usability is a primary contributor to training for cybersecurity. Because at some point, if you make the cyber hygiene of your staff load-bearing, you're just asking for hurt.
I think the hardest part about cybersecurity in general, actually, is how do you balance the requirements of security that are there and the user need to do what they need to do, right? Whatever that is, whether it's watch the film on the deck or charge my phone so I can call my husband because there's an emergency at home. Whatever the thing is, right? And the realities of our situation where we're hybrid and we're mobile and we're doing all these things, and sometimes, quite frankly, you don't think, like I got to do the thing. So how's the system secure enough that even if the human is human, it doesn't break the thing, but also that we haven't secured it to the point they can't do their jobs. We've made it so hard that things don't function as designed. And I think there's a balance, that's the title, right? There's a balance here in all of these things. How much autonomy, what kind of software you're putting in, when and where you apply it, and who, are the people ready for it? I feel like I see a lot of technology get delivered that the workforce is not ready for. They don't understand what's coming, it's just there. And I imagine that if that happens on a ship, it's even worse because you have less, you're out at sea, you may have less notice. Suddenly here's a thing. You have less time to get trained. And so those are all really good topics. We're not meant to solve this here. We're meant to discuss it here. And we're coming up on time and we have a few more minutes, I think. But I think, how do we start to have these conversations? How does the maritime community have these conversations, quite frankly? I mean, you mentioned the Coast Guard, we talked about the Navy, there's industrial, shipping and in the supply chains. I mean, we're not talking about like fishermen and things like this, but I mean, there's a whole range of people or groups in the maritime community. They don't all come together for coffee. So where is this concern that affects them all? And one of them being out of the loop is the weakest link now in that chain. Where does this conversation happen so that they're actually addressing these issues?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think events like this are really important for furthering the conversation and for kind of pushing the broader ecosystem to think technically about these problems and how we can resolve them. But I think secondly, more broadly, and I've spoken to this several different times throughout the day here today, but it's really important that it's a collaborative approach to security. And obviously, this is easier said than done. But at least from my opinion, what we put forward in the report is that it's important to leverage those entities that have connectivity across the ecosystem. The Navy is one, the Coast Guard is another, the IMO is another example of trying to be a little bit more international as we approach the problem set. And really coming to those individuals, those organizations, and helping kind of push them to lead the conversation and to bring in the actors that are so important within U.S. government, within the armed forces, within the private sector, and internationally to talk more about these issues. If we don't spread awareness, that's the very first thing that we need to do, is have people understand that this problem exists and that it needs to be handled. That's the very baseline to helping solve or mitigate these issues going forward. And I personally, for me, those actors that have kind of reach and breadth across the ecosystem need to be the one leading the way.
Excellent. So, Mike, you work at Naval X, and that's a community builder here on the Navy side. Are these topics that happen in the Naval X community? Are these conversations that happen there? Do you see non-traditionals coming in that are worried about this or anything like this? Or is this something that we need to think about teeing up in the future?
We've done some discussions with, I'd say, kind of purveyors of unmanned gear. I don't know that it always gets to the, how do we secure it and integrate it into the wider, ecosystem levels of conversation yet. But those are certainly things that we try to group together and link in. I think, on the Navy side, where we're more likely to see this start coming up in the near term is, we have a dedicated unmanned task force now, resident in OPNAV. There's a Fifth Fleet has now launched a task force to start looking at unmanned kind of in an operational capacity. Like, how do we make this work in a real AOR? And I think the conversation will probably be centered around those two style venues. And then, Naval X will be kind of, you should talk to that person. You should talk to that people. We call ourselves super connectors. So, making sure the right people are talking to the right people as we encounter them, but not necessarily hosting the forum, except for things like, Hack the Machine on Man.
So the Atlantic Council, is this also part of your role to kind of be that connector as well? And do you, like your report, is your report delivered to all of the different communities, and how does that work?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's basically exactly what the Atlantic Council was trying to do as a nonprofit think tank. Our kind of, the way that we tried to attack this issue set was to kind of outline some of the problems, identify what we call points of leverage or pre-existing programs, relationships, or entities that we can build upon to help kind of raise that baseline and then put forward recommendations. But throughout that entire process, we really had to do it with allies and partners and stakeholders throughout the community. So really early on, we were doing, Kess and I were doing extensive interviews with all sorts of folks internationally, private sector, Navy, Coast Guard, try and get a sense of what they're doing to solve the issues, kind of where they see the problems existing, and where they see kind of a bright light at the end of the tunnel. And our goal was to really synthesize all of this amazing information that we gathered from all these intelligent folks across the ecosystem and put together a plan that we could then bring back to these stakeholders and to folks like the Coast Guard, like the Navy and Naval X, like the IMO, and say like, hey, this is a path forward, this is an issue we need to be thinking about, these are the partners that you need to be working with on this issue. And then part of what we do as a think tank is actually convene, so bringing those people together to talk about the issues as well.
I would challenge that, we bring in non-traditionals, particularly at HACKtheMACHINE, is one of the things we try and encourage. I would challenge that we actually probably need to, I hear these conversations, right? I'm hearing this topic, and if I put on a different hat and say, look, I'm a programmer, I do cyber secure software, that's what I do, right? And I work for a completely different industry, but I've got tools and things that we've built for some of our other major systems that could apply here, right? Maybe we actually go to some other groups that are completely external to the MTS in that community and say, hey, look, you in academia, you do a really good job of training people really fast, just in time on certain things. We need to integrate that into our system. Or you do really well with building, natively building software and helping the workforce know how to do that and recognize it, or how to recognize these differences and attacks and things like this from a different community.
Yeah, the security researcher community, particularly around events like the ICS villages, like DEF CON, like DEF CON Hack the Sea. These are folks who on a day-to-day basis are thinking about how they can break stuff and cause problems for people, and looking at and putting hands on actual systems. And that's a group that we think is really, really crucial to pushing forward the solution, because it needs to be technical first. Events like Hack the Sea, as well as big convenings like DEF CON, are really, really strong places to move forward to this conversation and to help people think about the issue set more broadly.
Awesome. We got a couple minutes left, so Gary and Mike, I'd like to give you guys a chance.
Yeah, I think the user awareness and the training is important, but I think that, I'm not actually worried about the Navy and the Coast Guard so much, because, they have a system whereby somebody gets qualified before they're allowed to be in a particular position. And what I don't think we're seeing, though, as much is in the commercial world, because cyber really hasn't been integrated into the safety and training requirements that licensed crew has. And I think that's one of the major issues. I mean, you mentioned earlier about cybersecurity as a buzzword. I actually have never been a fan of cybersecurity as a buzzword, because to me, it takes a focus off what we're really trying to secure, and that is the information. And that's what the focus and the mindset needs to be on. And so, teaching people, about best practices, providing a human-machine interface that's understandable and not overly confusing. You're absolutely right about the balance between being able to do your job and security. Although if you build me the right HMI and just say, you have to use two-factor authentication. You can't write the password up on the sticky note like Will was alluding to. I mean, there are a whole lot of steps that we could take that are relatively easy, relatively straightforward, and relatively inexpensive, and you could eliminate a whole lot of problems.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I would also say it depends on the threat model too. So to go back to the control of the crew versus control of remote. If we were trying to defend against a remote attacker and they had to guess a 128-bit password, that'd be pretty secure, but it would be pretty hard for the crew, the human, to remember and type in. And so maybe it actually makes sense to trade off. They're going to write it down in their wheel book and carry that with them. And knowing that, if an actual ship full of pirates came and took over the ship, they'd be able to, steal that wheel book and log into the system. But it's all going to go back to who are you trusting and what are you trusting them to do and not do, as the case may be. But yeah, I think a lot of this is going to be, you definitely need this collaboration between communities. I'm so glad we're doing events like this. I'm so glad we've done events like, DEF CON and have Defense Digital Service come in and have people like attack an operational F-16 operating system. Because those are the kind of things that'll help, transfer over. The other thing I'd say is, I also feel the Navy and Coast Guard are generally in better shape, but, so much of what the Navy and Coast Guard mission is to kind of ensure and enhance the prosperity of, the U.S. and its allies. And, the prosperity of the U.S. and its allies is like 99% on the private sector. Private ship captains, transiting the water, often on ships that are not even U.S. flagged or U.S. crewed. And so, there's a great deal of, it doesn't help the Navy to, not get attacked if the civilian marketplace is easily attackable,
Yeah.
right? It's just, now it's the lowering tide lowers all boats. So that's the other thing I worry about, is just making things better for everybody.
Well, clearly you guys have lots to think about this, so we could talk forever, but I'd love to thank all of you, Commander Pine, Dr. Kessler, Will, for being here today and being so engaging and enlightening. None of the audience engagement would have been possible without Parker. We didn't have a lot of people in Slido this time, so guys, this is on you. I was able to go see some of the comments and get some notes there, but we really want to have more engagement. We have tons we could talk about, so stay engaged. Get on our LinkedIn, Twitter, Slack. Don't go anywhere. Next up is an awesome segment on data science readiness, from skills to tools and what needs to change fast. Kind of dovetails into what we were just talking about. We're going to have about a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back.
Everybody.
Thanks, Gary.